But thank you everyone for coming this evening. Once again, I'm Uri Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Slifka Center. I want to welcome everyone to tonight's Slifka Center Online Salon. It's great to see everyone, and I want to wish a happy and a meaningful Memorial Day to all, especially those who are veterans or families. We want to thank all those who have given for their service. So once again tonight, I'm joined by Rabbi Jason Rubenstein, the Howard M. Holtzman Jewish Chaplain, who is going to act as moderator, as is our general custom for tonight's session with our special guest, David Makovsky, who Jason will introduce in a moment. As those of you who have joined previous Slifka online salons know, this series is a new initiative that parallels the moving of the entire Slifka Center operation online following the COVID-19 related closure of our physical building and the Yale campus more broadly. Over these weeks, we found our students to be in need of direct support through this time in ways that are parallel to the ways we support them during normal times. We're on the front lines of helping students through this formative yet challenging time of life, and that work continues in the virtual space in an even more concentrated form than it took before. As we continue to learn more about what next year will look like, next year in the academic calendar, it becomes clearer and clearer that the need for gathering virtual community is only going to grow greater, since social distancing will level any communal gatherings that would normally be in person. As this period drags on, our work supporting students emotionally, socially, Jewishly, and intellectually will only become more important. We are ready for this task. One of the good things to come out of this opportunity is to host events like this one, to bring thought leaders from around the world into contact with you, our community of alumni, students, parents, and friends who recognize that once the acuteness of COVID-19 passes, other issues which were previously at the forefront will return. Undoubtedly, Israel will be one of them. We spend a lot of time at Slifka Center doing Israel engagement and education because we know that a relationship with Israel is an important element of Jewish identity. We also know that this is an area where, as a community, we are least prepared to engage with the inevitable pluralism of thoughts, perspectives, values, and politics within our own ranks. While God, Shabbat, kosher, and some might even say the question of egalitarianism in the prayer space have all receded as divisive issues in many parts of the Jewish community, Israel stands virtually alone as a veritable third rail. And just as there has been much debate about these other issues in past generations, so too there is on Israel. And that is the challenge for which we are preparing our students to participate. How can we embrace Jewish pluralism on Israel without betraying our Jewish values? How can we embrace those who ask questions about decisions Israel has made and continues to make, while also celebrating all the Jewish state contributes to our very lives and safety as Jews? Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, how can we, as the inheritors of the tradition of the great sage Rabbi Hillel of Mishnaic fame, follow in his footsteps to have our own ideas and positions sharpened by the exercise of stating our opponent's position before our own? Whatever aspects of the Israel discussion resonate with you, we hope that tonight's conversation with David Makovsky will be stimulating, and I know we're all looking forward to hearing from him and my esteemed colleague, Rabbi Jason Rubenstein, as they engage in the discussion tonight. We've had a number of terrific salons in the past: Dean Marvin Chun, Yale professor, philosophy professor Shelley Kagan, Lisa Blatt, who's argued more cases before the Supreme Court than any other woman in history, who spoke about the current state of the Supreme Court. And keep your eyes peeled for the next Slifka Online Salon, which will be in June. We'll be making announcements about that shortly. Recordings of our past presentations can be accessed on our website, slifkacenter.org, using the Slifka Online Salon quick link. As always, submit your questions to Rabbi Jason through the chat function found along the bottom of the Zoom screen. Thank you for respecting the others on the call, and keep your questions concise. We also want to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be available on our website later this week, along with recordings of our previous Slifka Center salons. We're excited to share these salons with you in keeping with Slifka Center's goals to explore the intersection of what is Jewish, American, and Yale in our constantly changing world. Jason, take it away.
Good evening, everybody. Uri, thank you for getting us started. And David, thank you for joining us all the way from Maryland. And I want to thematize something that Uri opened with, that there are two deeply intertwined conversations. One is Israel, its past, its future, the challenges it faces. And the second is the American conversation about that, particularly on college campuses. And we're blessed to have a guest who is an expert really in both of those. And I can attest to this because about 19 years ago, give or take a year, when I was an undergraduate, in a Jewish immersive group, David Makovsky came and presented to us and facilitated just a dynamic and clearly memorable session, and is part of why I'm excited for him to share the wisdom in a situation that's gotten no simpler with us, but you have gotten wiser. As hard as it is for my still 19-year-old part of myself to imagine. So David Makovsky is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and Director of the Project on Arab-Israel Relations there. He's also an adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University's Paul and Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. It's a mouthful. And in 2013 to 14, he worked in the office, the US Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israel-Palestinian Negotiations. He's the author of numerous monographs and essays related to the Middle East, and the co-author with Dennis Ross of 2 books of the 2019 Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destinies, and the 2009 bestseller Myths, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America in the Middle East. Professor Makovsky, we are thrilled to have you here. We're gonna just start off, if you could tell us, really share your own narrative of this conflict, this situation, this part of the world and America's role in it. I'll be monitoring the chat for questions. I will also exercise a little bit of my own prerogative as your interlocutor to throw questions, but you don't need to worry about kind of what people are sending in. I will channel all that to you. And I want to encourage people in the chat to also respond in textual format in a respectful and thoughtful and humble vein, which will make that its own productive space for conversation. So Professor Makovsky, I'm turning it over to you here. Oh, and you're muted. Let me just, you're muted.
Okay.
Perfect.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So Rabbi Rubenstein, thank you for that very generous introduction, and Uri Cohen as well. It's good to be back with you. I was saying that one of my recent research assistants and intern, who I think might be on this call, is Will Ellison, is a graduate, and Leah Weiner also graduated. She was from Israel, and she was also a research assistant. So I feel like I'm a beneficiary of Yale and Yale Hillel, so I should be thanking you. Look, I was asked to be a bit autobiographical. I'm going to try not to talk too long so we can have a good discussion. People say, how did you get into all this stuff? Like, you grew up in St. Louis. And I say, look, it's true for me, and I'm dating myself very easily here. I turned 60 next month, but when I was 17, Anwar Sadat came to Israel. It was electrifying. I remember I was glued to the television set. At a young age, I felt, though I understood something really monumental has happened. Israel had been fighting wars, 48, 56, 67, 73, the war of attrition in the middle of all that. And here was somebody who gets off a plane, goes to the Knesset and says, no more war, no more bloodshed. And it was a remarkable moment. I think it's one of the electrifying moments of the 20th century. And I felt that had a claim on me. I felt that, once in 2,000 years, the Jews get a state. This was something that had to somehow intersect with my life. I was not alive during the Holocaust or the birth of Israel, but I knew that how monumental this was. And the question was, could it survive in an atmosphere that was not, very open to such a state? And so with all these wars, the question got deeper. But the Sadat visit was a turning point, and I think that's when, for me, I decided I want my life somehow to intersect with this idea. Is there a way to make Israel more secure by having peace agreements with its neighbors? Then I was a student activist. I was a undergrad at Columbia.
I went on to become the head of the World Union of Jewish Students. I knew that Israel was the idea of not just the homeland, but a haven for the Jews from persecuted communities. And here the Soviet Jewry movement, the Ethiopian Jewry movement, all kind of intersected with that idea. And the geopolitics, frankly, and that would come to full fruition with the end of the Cold War. Suddenly Israel was going to get over 1 million immigrants, be the equivalent of the United States absorbing France within just a few years. It was as big of a challenge as it was a blessing. Israel did not have to pay to educate, hundreds of thousands of people out of the over 1 million that arrived. And they came with advanced degrees and really set the foundation for Israel's startup nation and how it has been known today. By then, I was on to the next chapter of my life. I went to the graduate school, in I should say Boston, to this group, or no, at Harvard. And I said I wanted to go and be a journalist there. I wanted to just study history. And that's when I did that in the late 80s. And then it was my good fortune to come really at the end, just as the Gulf War still hadn't happened, but the Gulf War, the end of the Cold War, and to be there in the 90s and have a front row history as a diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, over those close to 11 years. It was an amazing moment because you saw the geopolitics and the Jewish significance of the geopolitics really coming to full fruition. Like I said, there was over 1 million Jews from the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, that arrived. The Madrid conference. I wrote a book on Israeli decision-making in Oslo. Suddenly, Israel was meeting Arab countries at multilateral talks, at economic conferences in the 90s. And it seemed like almost a messianic age on a certain level. But at the same time, with all these opportunities, it was clear that there was also rejectionism that could torpedo everything, and Hamas bombs, and there was it was a scary time as well. There were also people on the Jewish side that were not happy with this agreement. I don't want to make a moral equivalence, but I think some of the settler movements and others, and of course the horrific moment of the killing of Rabin, who I traveled around the world with, and he made a big impact on me. And the middle name of my oldest son in English is in Hebrew is Yitzchak. So I then, in terms of my own story, I went on to the think tank world in the year 2000. I've been 20 years at the Washington Institute. As Rabbi Rubenstein pointed out, I took time off to be part of the U.S. peace delegation under the Secretary of State, John Kerry, 2013-14. And I've seen Israel grow in many ways, in a good way. I mean, anyone who goes there, sees all the skyscrapers everywhere, that Israel's GDP per capita is over 40,000, is in the league now with Japan and France. Its overall GDP is $400 billion. It is thrived. It's got rail infrastructure. It's an amazing thing. And there's been this convergence, and I saw this firsthand. I was invited to speak at an Arab conference in Abu Dhabi a few months ago before COVID, and was in Bahrain too. And the acceptance of Israel, primarily because they're afraid the U.S. might be leaving the Middle East. They don't know what to expect from the United States. But as one of the Emirati senior officials said to me, David, we know there's one country that can't leave the Middle East, and that's Israel, because it's in the Middle East, and we need Israel to thwart Iran's regional ambitions. So in many ways, Israel has had a period of ascendance that I think was anything I could have never imagined when I was 17 years old, glued to the television set, watching Anwar Sadat. But for all the good news, there's challenging news, and there's challenging news that I don't, brush under the rug. And that is the Palestinian issue. And we know this issue, to put it in sports terms, the United States tried on 3 occasions to hit the home run ball. I was part of the team on one of those 3 occasions. There was Clinton in 2000, there was Condoleezza Rice effort in 2007-8, and then was our effort of 2013-14. But whenever you try to swing for the fences, the chances are you could strike out. And therefore I'm more of a gradualist in my approach. I think we need some solid singles. I'm happy to discuss this further on. But how does this lead me to the book? It was the day after Trump won, if you want to know exactly the date. I went into Dennis Ross, my co-author's office. I said, Dennis, I think we need to inspire people. People just think the problems are too big and the leaders are not up to the problems. And what we need to do is to remind people of journeys of great leaders of Israel who were able to make extraordinary, historic decisions. These were people that went on their own journey. They were each kind of, either totally transformed or at least they were modified in their views before they made their historic decisions. But they believed that the country first, and they were willing to, take on even political allies. We chose 4 leaders. We could have maybe chosen others. We were focusing on national security issues, and we thought that the natural ones to choose were Ben-Gurion, Begin, Rabin, and Sharon. We are not here to chisel their portrait or anything, visage on like a Middle East Mount Rushmore. Some of these people were flawed, but we took 4 decisions, 4 journeys. And we think that they shared a common view of leadership. And that was they understood what was truly important. They never shied away from making painful decisions, and they put the state, not their political interests, first. They understood the cost of acting and what are the consequences of not acting. In other words, not just what are the risks if I act, but what are the risks if I don't act. They accepted the burden of decision-making that they felt did rest on their shoulders, and they did not have the luxury to let these problems drift to their successors. They were political leaders who didn't just want to survive, but basically felt they were historic figures who had to lead the public and not follow it. In other words, this meant educating people about mistakes, painful realities, and the risks to the state. In other words, they defined leadership not as popularity, but what they felt the state required at the time. And that meant persevering amid terrible political opposition. They felt that they were not just there to hold power for power's sake, and they did not flinch if they thought this is what the country needed. They put the country first. Now, in the case of Rabin, like Sadat, if we wrote a book on Arab leaders, they paid with their lives in the case of Rabin and Sadat. And I could go into, I'm just afraid not to talk too long. So I think I should not dwell on these different case studies of Ben-Gurion, Begin, Rabin, and Sharon now, but I'm happy to do so in the discussion. But they had a sense of land and demographics ran through Israel's history, and we hope if you read the book, you'll get that sense. And they felt that while Israel has met very real threats, Israel also has a threat to its identity that's no less real. Doesn't mean it's the only issue. It might seem abstract when you have Hezbollah and Hamas and Iran to deal with, but basically we wrote this book believing that Israel is soon confronting a fateful choice, and we feel that if it stays on its current path, Israel will become, by default, one state for 2 peoples. And we're concerned about this, and we're worried about the shift in the paradigm from territory to rights as the guiding paradigm. Our view is to try to preserve the option to separate from the Palestinians. We don't think a Palestinian state could suddenly be established tomorrow morning. We think it needs to be gradual, but we think that you have to embark on the direction even if you don't reach the destination immediately. We're afraid that if you settle in all these areas outside of Israel's security barrier, that the net effect is that you've shut the door. Right now, about 85% of the Israeli settlers, 76 if you don't include people from East Jerusalem, live in about 7 to 8% of the land, largely adjacent to Israeli urban areas. And it's the remainder, about 109,000 people outside that barrier that are scattered all over the West Bank, settlers that is. And we're worried that if there isn't some decision taken and you just, kind of sleepwalk or, you know, keep going, drifting the way you're going, that this one-state paradigm emerges. How does it emerge? It emerged because the Palestinians give up. And they just say, you know what, forget it. There is no two-state solution here. We just want to vote in Israeli elections. I don't think Israel is going to ever agree to that, given its ethos of Israel as both a Jewish state. But I do think that ideas that could be fringe, maybe not in the academic world at all, but in the public domain in the United States, could go from fringe to mainstream. And we're worried about that. And that's why we wrote this book, because we see with the four leaders, people who took the big picture about what Israel needed. And we think that kind of leadership is needed. I want to just be clear, none of this is to get the Palestinian side off the hook. We think the security dimension is crucial. That's why we called the book, Be Strong and of Good Courage, because in the Middle East, if you're not strong, you're dead. But being strong is necessary, but it's not sufficient. You have to be strong and wise. And that's why we wrote this book, to say we don't yield to anyone when it comes to concerns about Israeli security, but we feel that the security is just the first step towards this broader concern of Israel avoiding becoming a one-state, going into that one-state paradigm. So why don't I stop here and I look forward to the discussion.
Beautiful. David, thank you. I mean, you just covered, you know, decades and continents, the personal, the political, all once. Thank you. So who better to ask our first question than William Ellison? William, you're unmuted.
Hey, David.
I didn't plant it. I didn't plant it.
Yeah, hi. So yeah, I mean, David, so I was just wondering, I guess it's kind of going to the present more, but what is your assessment as of kind of today, most recently, to what extent annexation, you know, / extending sovereignty, whatever you want to call it, will go forward? If so, do you think there's still a chance it might be limited just to the settlement blocks, just to the Jordan Valley, maybe just to both of those, but not the outlying settlements and those issues?
Okay, thanks, Will. And again, this was not planted. He did a fantastic job as my intern. I miss him, but he's in good hands with Dennis Ross. So that's that was fine. We had our own swap between us. To put it in Middle East territorial terms. So look, I would, Will, I mean, look, the short answer is we don't know yet. Pompeo came back from his visit last week, and there's a range here. What complicates things is you have this Trump peace plan as an overlay, as you know. And under the Trump peace plan, Israel would annex basically all of 130 settlements, 130. Now, 15 of the 130, just to be technically precise, would be enclaves inside this Palestinian state. And 51 or so of the settlements would be in the security barrier. And the remaining 79 or so are outside the barrier. And it's those 79 that Dennis and I, are very concerned about in particular. Now, Netanyahu has the votes on a certain way to proceed, even though he does not have the support of blue and white, because he could call upon a Victor Lieberman, who's in the opposition, who's a bitter foe of Netanyahu's, his former chief of staff, but Lieberman has said he would support it. So this is the first time in history, in 72 years, that you've had a situation that the president of the United States is to the right, maybe, of an Israeli prime minister. And so people say, wait a second, if Trump says it's fine, that's like the ultimate imprimatur for an Israeli prime minister, that he has that room. Now, of course, I think for the president, and I always try to be respectful, I think, he's got his eye on the November election. Whether annexing all these settlements is going to help him with the evangelicals, or going to help him with the Orthodox community, is, I think, questionable. I don't think it makes a difference, frankly. But he might say, sure, do whatever the hell you want to do. But Israel has got to decide for its future to look beyond November and needs to think, well, okay, but is this the wise thing for Israel to do, even if it has America's blank check in this regard? So the question is, Pompeo and Kushner seem to say, look, we don't want this to be just with the Likud. We want this to have broader buy-in in Israel. If that's really the case, that could empower these two guys, Gantz, the new defense minister of blue and white, and Gabi Ashkenazi, the new foreign minister, both former chiefs of staff, as you know. And that could mitigate this from an all-purpose annexation of 130 settlements, plus the Jordan Valley, which is probably about 18% of the West Bank there. You're talking about 30% of the West Bank. And our fear is that if you annex every settlement, there's not much to talk about here in terms of a two-state solution. And if you do the Jordan Valley, you're certainly at odds with the Jordanians who see the Jordan Valley on the eastern frontier of the West Bank, abutting Jordan. And the fear there of Jordan is, the king has said it will be a massive conflict. He's not going to go to war with Israel. But, clearly that, the fear of the Jordanians is if there's no hope for two states, you annex all the settlements and you annex the Jordan Valley, what you're going to end up doing is creating a migration flow into Jordan. And that by de facto, what they call the Watan al-Badil, the alternative homeland, the Palestinians becomes Jordan, Jordan is Palestine. Now, so that's the fear there. I think the Jordan Valley issue is a key piece to this. And here's one more factor, though, that I think could mitigate the issue a bit. And I'm trying never to be got into wishful thinking. But, and it's counterintuitive for many, maybe some of our viewers and listeners, although I realize there's some of you follow this stuff very, very closely, is that the Israeli security establishment, the best relationships that Israel has is with the Arab security establishments. That's the kind of counterintuitive piece to this whole new Middle East, that it's not your father's or mother's Middle East anymore. Israel's got great security cooperation with the Palestinian Authority because they see it's good for them in the West Bank. Now, they have suspended it, but they've suspended it before short term and they've renewed. So we don't know if this is definitive. Jordan and Israel, I was just in Amman before the COVID thing, and the security people didn't have enough superlatives. And one of the top cabinet ministers said, I'm going to tell you how politically poisonous things are with Netanyahu, but the security relationship's outstanding. And the same in the Gulf, too. The security relationships are great because there's a common enemy, which is Iran. So the question is the security establishment in the political system, normally their weight is strong. And Netanyahu was careful not to go on a head-on collision with the security people. If there's ever a commission of inquiry, which happens in Israel from time to time, the first question is, why'd you go against the advice of the security establishment? So will he finesse this instead of trying to annex 30% of the West Bank? Will he go just for the blocks, which in theory would permit two states, inside the security barrier while having these land swaps? But there's no doubt that anything that sounds unilateral, just the word unilateral, is going to have a certain, it'll have a certain resonance to that word that will not be positive. So I don't want anyone to interpret what I'm saying that if they annex within the blocks, that's a good thing. If they say, well, what if they annex within the blocks and they say, we're not building anymore, anywhere else, that's it, it's over. But I don't see Netanyahu doing that at this time. So I think in theory, there are enough mitigating forces with the security establishment, with the political opposition within, with the desire of Pompeo and Kushner to try to get a broader buy-in, with the fact that the European Union is Israel's largest trading partner, and even if it doesn't do full-fledged sanctions, because you need consensus, and Israel can rely on some Eastern Europeans. Israel also wants the science community, what's called Europe 2020 now, Europe Horizon, hundreds of millions of euros to help the Israeli scientific community. There's a lot of different dimensions. But the Prime Minister just said today, the Likud faction, I'm going forward. And so, we'll have to see. Is this Trumpian in a certain way? Start with a high opening bid, and then, you could always lower it if you see opposition. We don't know for sure. I think there are a lot of countervailing purposes, but I would not rule out at least some form of annexation that I am concerned will be complicating. And we haven't talked about bipartisanship in this country, which I think is crucial. And I worry about the implications there as well.
You mentioned Trump, you mentioned Eastern Europe. I can't help but ask, especially after another round of elections there, where Netanyahu's closeness with Viktor Orban, who's kind of made some terrifying moves in the COVID kind of regime that we're under, questions about Israeli democracy, the independence of the judiciary, where you see kind of, especially in the context of thinking about, your book's gambit is all these leaders were here at 48, the current leadership wasn't. And really just to put the question starkly in the context of a global democratic recession, what do you see, especially with these kind of pressures of a large demographic problem in Israel? The stakes are for the kind of the health of Israeli democracy at the present.
Absolutely right. They are. We make no bones. Look, on the Eastern European front, and I understand that this is complex, and I don't, I never like to caricature anything. I always want to assume best arguments on both sides and try to work it from there. I think, the argument for the outreach with the Eastern Europeans is that Israel doesn't exactly have a surplus of friends that will stick up for Israel in the UN arena. Even the Arab states that have undergone an evolution, Israel's relations with the Egyptians, Israel's relations with Jordan, Israel's relationship with some of these Gulf states that I mentioned, the Emirates, the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Omanis, these guys, it's still all under the table. Now, it's very crowded under the table, and it's so crowded that the table is starting to levitate, but it's still under the table due to kind of political sensitivities in the public and the Arab world and with Palestinians and the like. So Israel's view is, don't have the luxury to choose your friends because Israel is outvoted. If Israel said the world was spherical, they would get a majority to say the world is flat. So I understand, the beggars can't be choosers line of argument. I don't want to minimize that. At the same time, Israel sees itself as a state of the Jews too. And that means being mindful of Jewish communities, whether it's in Budapest, whether it's in, in Vienna, where there's been another kind of government like this, whether it's in Warsaw. And the question is, how does these more populist tendencies impact those sets of relationships too? This populism is going around the world, and it's only at a time of economic downturn, it seems to me, it only keeps rising. So how does this, it might be diplomatically inconvenient, but can you balance that with this sense of, what does it mean for relations with the other? That's how these governments thrive. Kind of, they try to sometimes marginalize minorities that do not fit the mainstream type. And how you draw that equilibrium is not easy. So I don't mean to say that Israel should just, get rid of all these people. I don't think they have that luxury, but at the same time, anything that looks like an embrace or that seems almost exclusivist is going to have implications in those countries, just like in our country. The importance of bipartisanship. And look, every prime minister of Israel needs to be on good relations with the president of the United States. And there is a Jewish principle of hakarat hatov, acknowledging when someone's been good to you. But there is a line, and it's a line that's not always easily like a bright line, but anything that looks like an exclusivist embrace, I'm concerned. And by the way, I'm not saying this because I served in a Democratic administration. I truly believe that a cautionary tale is the US-Saudi relationship. I mean, you do not want to be Saudi Arabia today. Now, it's true, you could say, well, yeah, look what they did with Khashoggi. I mean, they're their own worst enemies. Agreed. And look at the price of oil that has plummeted with Corona. Agreed. But the Saudis for 20 years, basically, they had a guy who was their ambassador in Washington named Bandar. And Prince Bandar, basically, during a Democratic administration, lived in Switzerland. And then now when you need friends, you don't have friends. So you never want Israel to be a partisan cause, whether it's a Democratic cause or a Republican cause. The genius of Israel was to understand that Democrats and Republicans can't agree if it's dark outside or light outside, but they did agree on support for Israel. So finding a way to nurture that, I think, is really important on the bipartisanship. On the issue of democratic laws, I think, you're right, Rabbi, to call, concern to that. My hope with this new government is that it's a kind of a mutual veto system on state and religion that, unlike the 2015 and 2020 government, which was purely more on the right, that we won't see this kind of lurch more on the religion and state issues, the synagogue and state, church and state issues, like we saw in the last 5 years, because of the mutual veto of blue and white and Likud. Now, of course, Likud has got, 52 seats, 53, even if Yamina is outside the coalition, and blue and white is only 19 with the Labor Party people as well. So it's, how do you maintain parity at a time of disparity? And will this game end at halftime with, will there be actually a rotation? Bibi says yes. I remember they doubted that Shimon Peres would do the rotation, and 84, 86, he actually did. So we'll see. But maintaining parity with the disparity of seats is going to be a challenge. But I do think that unlike the government of 2015 to 2020, the last 5 years, there's more hope to at least stop the slide to the right, in a way that there wasn't there. But I don't deny your question, which is an excellent one, about some of these anti-democratic laws that we saw pop up.
Fascinating, fascinating. So I want to pivot in a second to the campus context. We are a college organization. I want to kind of pause for station identification for a moment. First, with a thank you as we start to get towards 9, towards my really incredible colleagues, Uri, whom you heard from, also Jennifer Rojan-Wallace, our development director, and Lynn Jackson-Quinn, our development associate, Evan Wexler, who does the communications, and Benjamin Laufer does kind of everything behind the scenes. There's a whole team here producing this AV show you're participating in. And also to notify you of a very short, the shortest of surveys that is visible on the Slifka Center little Hollywood square there, which is now spotlighted, and you'll get sent in the chat window at the end. And to the extent that you can really take on the order of 1 minute when this is over to share your experience with us, that'll be very valuable, especially as we plan subsequent episodes of Slifka Salons in the future. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. So we can't, there's a bunch of questions that are popping up in the chat, which are amazing. And I want to make sure before we hit time that we talk about the campus conversation, or maybe better, lack of conversation about Israel, around Israel, against Israel, and the ways that even at Harvard and Yale, things are very, very different climates. The ways that Hillels get triangulated into this, or East language was the third rail. And if you could speak to what you see, I think the image you used from the peace negotiations in the Middle East is not bad. It's hard to imagine tomorrow, even if everyone were to materialize on campus, things being all better and everyone being able to have civil, productive conversations. But maybe what some singles would look like, or what bright spots of initiatives or success look like, because that's such a frequent topic in the Jewish press and a major component of Jewish students' lives on campus.
That's great. Okay, good. Thank you. And by the way, if I could throw in a commercial too, if that's okay. Thank you guys for all of your work, and Hillel International, which has gotten me to campuses. I think I counted up 148 campus visits all across the United States. And it's before I did the book, I got a new podcast out on U.S.-Israel relations, talking to historians about dramatic moments in the U.S.-Israel relationships. If you have an iPhone, just called Decision Points. Working on a second season now by Middle East leaders, Israeli and Arab leaders too. And also people say, well, where did I read your writing? So I now put it all in one place, davidmakovsky.com, and a free newsletter. So there's my commercial. But in terms of where do you go from here, look, I have felt always when it comes to campuses, you know, and talking to students that, you know, the key is to avoid being divisive in really, you know, ripping up a community. And that the goal is, how do you build versus how it's, you know, rather than what do you destroy. We don't want a situation where you import the divisiveness of the Middle East. We should export the greatness of America, which is our pluralism, our sense of dialogue. And for me, that means trying to look at ways, and there are enough of these programs that are out there that are done by different campuses, to also do things like practical coexistence. Instead of engaging in highly charged emotive debates, and also, you know, if you have people that could afford, you know, although I must say I spoke at a Yale small group of people that were really immersed in this subject a few years ago, and was struck by, you know, the people that, you know, that were interested in some of these issues. But for the most part, I do think things like an alternative spring break, that you would help do, you know, practical social action in each community, both Israeli and Palestinian, but things that bring people together, not things that rip them apart. I tend to think that that is useful. I could tell you a project that I've done that once I did at Yale. I did it for 7 years in the University of California with my colleague, Rafael Omari, who's now with me at the Washington Institute. And what we did was a reverse kind of peace negotiations, where we had the Jewish kids take the Arab position, and we had Muslim Americans take the Israeli position. And it's really intense. There's a lot of maps. And I don't know if there's anyone on this call who was on the, who participated in the Yale session we did a few years back. But I find that I get this, I would run the Israeli team with the Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. And all the time, it always happened where people would say to me, you know, David, we didn't know this thing was so complicated. We didn't know about the maps. We don't know about the land. You know, we talk about it on a more abstract level. And so I think it doesn't hurt to, you know, to have exercises where people have to put themselves in the other side's shoe. But I think our guiding principles should be what brings our communities together, not what rips them apart, like BDS and things like that. So I'm, you know, I have no doubt that the annexation debate, if it does go through this summer, it's going to be more complex on campus. Although I have found the toughest times on campus are clearly when there's something very visual, like a war or something like that, like the wars in Gaza and things of that. Things that I thought would be more of a challenge on campus, the Goldstone report, there are different reports of the UN didn't really play into the campus session. So it depends on timing and the like. But, you know, I think that we should look for ways to, you know, to reach out on practical things that are common, that accentuate the common humanity of both sides. And I think spring break trips and things like that. I do things with the Olive Tree Initiative. You know, they go on these study trips at the University of California, but for like 10 years. I meet with them before they go and when they come back. But things that enable people to really understand the other side's narrative, I think could be helpful. But I don't see the BDS in that context. I see that as being very divisive and making one side feeling very marginalized, and I don't think that's helpful.
Right. Thank you. That's a great blueprint. We got one of the earliest questions was from David Liebschutz, David, about China, and I would love to unmute you and take this one here. We're talking about common humanity, and let's remember that this is not just the Middle East and America, but really we're talking in a global context now.
Hi, Jason. David, thank you for your remarks. I just want to make this in a global context. What role do you think the Chinese or even the Russians have in trying to build bridges using economic power or other power? And I'll go back on mute and listen to your answer.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. And look, China is both promise and peril. It's promise because, I mean, I remember getting to go with David Levy when he opened up an Israeli embassy in China in the start of the 90s. At the time of the Madrid conference, it was a time of great hope. Israel had kind of quiet security relations with China, with Shaul Eisenberg and some of these other people who had Chinese relations. But what's happened, so on one hand, there's a lot of promise there, given, you know, the depth of the Chinese market, of course. But the peril here is that China's, and I'm not, you know, I want to be careful. I'm not an expert here on Belt and Road initiatives and how China has been able to kind of enmesh itself in different countries' economies. But what invariably happens is that Israel doesn't really have a good regulatory framework to deal with tech transfers to China. And it's more voluntary. This is private sector cooperation. And for the United States, that's very concerned. No one is saying that Israel's taking American technology to China, but that there's not enough of a regulatory framework is pitting Israel against the United States as it gets closer to China. China is building Israel's Haifa port, but that's where the Sixth Fleet of the US Navy comes. And you have people in the Navy at a high level saying, look, if you build this port, we're not going to make port calls on Israel. So it's a triangle in many ways. And you want to minimize the friction points. So this this technology framework is something that's not viewed as at America's expense. But because China gives these great bids on infrastructure projects, they're doing one for a desal project. Now they're one of the last two bidders, and that decision's about to come in 2 weeks. But it's right near a big Israeli Air Force base. So that was one of the main reasons why Pompeo came to Israel, is because of the concern about China. So I think the regulatory framework on technology cooperation with China needs to be very carefully calibrated. Russia, I'm a little skeptical. I mean, look, unlike the Soviet days when I was involved in the student activism world, Russia, as opposed to the Soviet Union, you know, once sees the advantage of having close ties with Israel. Over 1 million Russian immigrants who speak Russian. They see somehow a good relationship with Israel as a hedge when they have bad relationships with Washington, because they're convinced American Jews are so powerful, etc. That's kind of one side of the equation. But what's also happens is that Russia is playing both sides against the middle in Syria, which is on, as you know, in Israel's north, and Iran is there, Hezbollah is there, these Shia proxy networks are there. And basically, on one hand, the good news for Israel is that there's been a good relationship with Putin and Netanyahu. So he says, look, Israel, do what you have to do. So Israel gets its planes. It doesn't even go into Syrian airspace, but fires standoff rockets from Israeli airspace and knocks out what it has to knock out. But it's a crazy situation. You know how many foreign armies are in Syria? You have Israel, you have Russia, you have Iran, you have Hezbollah, you have Turkey, and I'm not even mentioning the Syrians themselves and the Kurds. It's a powder keg, and I just think that somehow Russia likes this idea that it's at the center and that it punches above its weight. Its GDP might be the size of Boston, but it is an international player. And if it could poke America in the eye, it'll do so. It's just more careful than it was in the Soviet days, but not enough that they will deliver hard messages that we see to the Iranians that they're close to as well. So it's so complicated there. And in that regard, the Syrian theater is an example that I'm concerned that Russia, instead of being part of a solution, is part of the problem, even though it's not taking the position it took in the 1980s, where it had no diplomatic relations with Israel. So I think in both the China case and the Russia cases, these countries are too important to ignore. But in each case, you have countervailing forces in terms of the U.S. relationships, their support of rejectionist groups in Syria and the like, that each of these sets of bilateral relations has to be navigated very, very carefully.
So for our last question before time, I want to turn things over to Matthew, who chatted a very moving observation here about some different communities in Israel that are connecting. And I also want to note, kind of in terms of being the change we want to see in the world, that even though our call is not exclusively male, the group chat has been, and therefore the question askers have been, which is not a reality I savor, but it is the world. I just wanted to not let that pass unnoted, and it was the case last call also, and to the extent people have suggestions about how to have a broader, more diverse, and more representative dialogue here on future ones, I would be eager for the input. And with that, Matthew, I'm turning the microphone over to you.
Thank you. As a doctor and also a singer, I pay attention to things like that. And obviously we have different geopolitical levels of concern. The last topic was one that I had considered, which is interesting. But in terms of the sort of internal Palestine issues, how powerful could it be to have the people themselves get together on a more community level? And this is brought out by the fact that, for instance, the Yale Alumni Chorus has relationships with the Jerusalem Youth Choir, which in its inception brought together Palestinian and Israeli kids, and they were actually a prominent force at one of the assassination demonstrations. So that, and also a recent documentary on the response in Israel to the COVID-19 crisis highlighted, perhaps intentionally, but highlighted how well together both Palestinian, Arab, and Israeli doctors were working, and staff were working together closely. And these are two human levels, music and medicine, that seem to be something that people can get together on a cross-cultural basis. So the bottom line of the question is, we've been talking about top-down solutions to getting things lined up. How about bottom-up? How effective could that be in the greater context?
Look, I love it. I mean, I really think it's so important to have the bottom-up wherever you can. You know, when I'm talking about solid singles, and you, Rabbi Rubenstein, was asking me about it in terms of the campuses. I thought the solid single is in the top-down sense is, Israel not building outside the security barrier, and the Palestinians not giving money to relatives of suicide bombers or perpetrators of violence, not to send the message that, you want to incentivize people to kill. And so to me, you deal with some of the gut fears of both sides, and that is land is a big fear for the Palestinians, and terror is a big fear for Israel. And so those are top-down singles. Now, bottom-up singles is what you say, and it's so important what you're saying. And I pray that this health cooperation that's going on between Israel and the PA now during COVID reminds people that there's just, too much history, too little geography. They live, I go to Ramallah on every trip. I'm in Israel usually 3-4 times a year, and I go to Ramallah, but Israelis never go. And the Palestinians don't come to Israel except those who are workers in Israel. And so I think it's so important that, I've had this conversation with Jibril Rajoub. Jibril is one of the contenders to be the successor to Abbas. I've known Jibril for 30 years. He spent 19 years in Israeli prison. He took Menachem Begin's book, The Revolt, and he translated it into Arabic, and he's translated other Israeli books into Arabic. And I said, wouldn't it be great through sports, Jibril? You're the commissioner of the Soccer Association, and the head of the Palestinian Olympic Committee on soccer, what they call the Football Association, to have an Israeli-Palestinian soccer teams. And he said, David, don't get me started on this. I said, why? He said, because that's normalization. First, let there be peace. And I said, but if we don't do the bottom up, I'm worried we'll never get there. And so there's a real obstacle here. And I don't want to make it sound like all the problems are on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side, because I'm Israel, but Israel doesn't have an anti-normalization problem. I mean, wouldn't it be great if you had high school kids from Ramallah who could talk about Palestinian reality in Tel Aviv high schools, and Israelis from Tel Aviv that could go to Nablus, to Tulkarm, you know, but it doesn't happen because that's considered normalization. And that's a dirty word, unfortunately. And that's why I worry when, you know, we have to do this single by single, but we'll never have transformation if you cannot get what you just said, which is to get the bottom up going. And there really has to be a campaign against this pernicious sense of anything that reeks of normalization, is what they call, is somehow not good. I mean, Abbas will meet an Israeli peace group, but he won't meet a Palestinian one. And again, I don't want to put the onus all on him. And I wish the Prime Minister Netanyahu would also reach out to the Palestinians, but he doesn't do that. But so I don't mean to pour cold water. I think we got to keep trying. We got to do whatever we could do. We can't give up. If Yale has these relationships, use these relationships. It might be easier for an American choir to talk over there and the Palestinian choir coming over here. And maybe that's like more of a triangle that way. Maybe that's a way to get it started. So I really want to encourage you to keep trying. I'm just saying.
There was also a documentary on an eminent Israeli conductor who had gone into the West Bank and had a very good experience with, I think it was primarily youth, but in an auditorium, big time. It wasn't like little things. So I'm just wondering, the main question that I wonder is it feasible? You know, when you think about the Arab Spring, that of course fizzled eventually because it was so overburdened by the governments. But in an Israel-Palestinian situation, I wonder whether it couldn't be more successful.
I think so. Look, the thing is, because they live almost on top of each other, that they know each other in a certain way. I mean, I could tell you that when I go to Ramallah, on the political level, these people could tell you the factions within Shas, the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party, and who is more peace-leaning and who is not. So on one hand, there's this knowledge, but on the public level, it doesn't seep through. It's like each side is kind of like wrapped, hermetically sealed in their own narrative, and it's frustrating that way. But I don't think we should give up. I really think the Palestinians need to reverse this anti-normalization. This thing you said about the conductor is hardening to hear, but I feel it's the exception that of the rule. I think we just got to find more exceptions, and if possible, to change the rule itself, because I believe you won't have peace unless that happens. Now, when I bring us back full circle to the beginning, Anwar Sadat was willing to take risks. Now you can say, yeah, he paid for it with his life, but if he would say, I'm not going to Israel until there's already a treaty, there never would have been a treaty. So I like your approach, and I focus often on government to government. It's part of what I do, but this is not at all to minimize what you're saying, which I love, which I think we need to find, if we can't do the front door, the side door, can't do the side door, the window, can't do the window, the basement, can't do the basement, the chimney. We need ways to reach out, because look at the polling data on both sides. We don't even have now 50%, which we used to have, saying 2 states. A few years ago, it used to be, I'm for 2 states, but it isn't happening because the other side doesn't want it. They don't want 2 states. Now, 2 states is still the plurality, but it's not the majority. And the numbers are going down. So there's a profound sense of popular disbelief that anything good is possible. And I think my hope is that the COVID economic health cooperation is a reminder, you've got external enemies and you have to come together. And my fear is when the crisis is over, that sense of urgency dissipates. And the question is, how do you seize the moment of the crisis to parlay it, to leverage it into something that's post-crisis? That I think is a real threat. A real challenge, I should say, and that needs to be something that has to be encouraged. We got to find these sparks of light and somehow build on them. So I think it's a good way maybe to end, to be in a hopeful way. But I think we just have to keep trying because of the climate that's out there is not positive and is not conducive often to these bottom-up initiatives. But I think they're really important.
Wow.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Makovsky. This is really, I just want to say personally that it's, as someone who spends my life surrounded by academics and people studying in depth, to hear someone bring such, not just a fluency with the details, but a real, a deep intimacy with them in a way that your worldview is so clearly shaped by events, by actors, by realities, by nuance, by complexity, and it takes some effort and some time to lay all that out, which you've done so generously over the last hour and change with us. And if I just wish more conversations, this could be the norm rather than the exception, and your voice could be.
How's this? I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Paradigmatic one that we all think about. So
I'm happy to continue it in New Haven if you want.
Make this fully transparent, because I actually find it quite moving. Our plan actually had been to have Professor Makovsky on campus as part of your book tour, and then that obviously didn't happen because campus isn't happening over the past 2 months. And this really has been our effort, really to raise up your voice and bring you the broader Yale community in conversation. So thank you again. I want to thank your assistant Basia also for her work, and we are really, it's wonderful to convene this community across space and time for conversation. It gives me like inspiration. I always find myself looking forward to being into a broader circle of humanity and of thought and conversation. And so I want to wish everyone on this call well, and as June approaches, there will be new installments, but mostly stay safe and healthy, and thank you for connecting. Don't forget that short survey at the end.